Hey everyone, it's Evan Kirstel. Have a fantastic discussion coming up today around 5G, my favorite topic. And as we all know, 5G is fundamentally changing telecom networks in ways we're only beginning to realize from previous tech evolutions. We're literally in 5G reconstructing the network from the ground up, disaggregating the infrastructure, introducing multi-vendor environments, bringing critical applications closer to the edge to provide, ultra low latency performance capabilities. So in a nutshell, everything is changing. But is your assurance strategy, from gaming to smart factories, the rise of Industry 4.0, life and death applications, mission critical use cases like remote healthcare, E911, autonomous vehicles, and more, mean that communication service providers must reevaluate their assurance strategies to keep up with the new tech demands being placed on the network. So the question for this live stream is, will traditional approaches, methodologies be able to keep up? And what strategies should telcos be investing in to future-proof their network? So to answer these questions, I'm really excited to welcome two experts, to say the least, from Spirent, Doug Roberts, SVP and General Manager, Spirent, and Chris Thompson, VP of Product Management for Lifecycle Service Assurance. That's a mouthful of a title there, Charles, but thanks for joining me today, guys.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Evan. Good morning and afternoon.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're live, so you never know where and when
right.
someone is listening. But let's start, Doug. I'd love to get you to introduce the opportunity that Spirent is helping address to our viewers. Many of us old telecom geeks know of Spirent as, the leading provider of test automation tools for the lab, when we used to go into labs. But it may be helpful to understand your position at Spirent within the assurance space. So would love you to illuminate, some background here for the viewers, Doug.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I think you couched it right in terms of, if you think about Spirent from a brand perspective, and I'll just say from a company and from a culture perspective, Spirent is a very well-known brand in and around the labs, from pre-certification to certifying infrastructure. I don't care if these are devices, virtual elements, cloud-based infrastructure. Spirent has been around for quite some time from both a wireline as well as a wireless perspective, as that kind of trusted source of information, if you will, as we certify infrastructure before it goes into what we have long called the pre-production stage. However, if you've been following Spirent, even on the periphery over the last couple of years, I suspect and I certainly hope that you've seen a number of notable changes in Spirent's corporate and go-to-market strategy, in that one of our core tenets is to grow well beyond the lab and to take much of the same technology, features, functions, and applied services that have served the lab so well for so long, and now replicate those capabilities in the live production network, or the live production and operational environments. And just as it goes in terms of timing within the industry, this strategy is extraordinarily well aligned with the dynamic and the deployment of 5G as a technology. Hence the reason I think we're chatting today.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great frame for our discussion. So let's look a bit of context, maybe a little bit of history. So what approaches have communication service providers been using to assure their networks, let's say in 4G and 3G, LTE, et cetera? Charles, what do you give us some background?
Yeah, so if you look at the history of service assurance within the operator space, the vast majority of operators have got these big, sort of heavyweight infrastructures of passive probing. So passive probing has sort of been the default go-to for a long time. It involves leveraging wire data as it traverses the infrastructure to then be analyzed in real time or near real time, and then those results to be propagated up. And obviously that means that you're looking at real user data. So as it traverses the wire, as the users are actually experiencing the service, experiencing the applications, you're finding out what's happening with those users at that point in time. So passive probing has been sort of the default go-to in 3G and 4G infrastructures for most operators, and there is just a massive industry for that technology.
Yeah, absolutely. And we often say 5G is not just another G. So what do you think, Doug? Do we need a new approach for 5G to change some of the legacy CSP, assurance dynamics and approaches?
Yeah, well, the short answer is yes. I think it all comes down to timeline and where on that time continuum our customers or the CSP community as a whole really sits in terms of where are they in this 5G deployment journey. As you can imagine, most of the 5G infrastructures that we're involved with, even today, are still very much hybrid forms of 4G, 5G technologies. And rarely will you find, even still today, as odd as it sounds, a true standalone 5G infrastructure that acts and maneuvers autonomously as the original specification outlined for these carriers. So it's a very, very, very challenging environment. So when you translate 5G as an infrastructure to the operational environment and you apply traditional service assurance, I'll say methodologies and approaches, what we have found in practice in conjunction with our customers is these methodologies simply don't work anymore. And part of the reason for this is the disaggregation. Everybody hears this term all the time, right? Hey, 5G represents the disaggregation of the network. Well, what does that actually mean? And I'm sitting here trying to find a visual. I'll tell you what, if this works, I'll share my screen out because I think a picture says 1,000 words. So let's see if this works.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see your screen.
Perfect. So, if you think about this, if you compare and contrast 4G, 5G from an actual infrastructure perspective, everybody hears about the cloudification of infrastructure, the disaggregation of infrastructure. And in reality, what this represents is if you look at 4G, right, traditional 4G LTE networks, those three dots that you see represent the old environment. And the old environment in its simplistic form. And look, I understand that I'm oversimplifying this to make a point, but the reality is the same. As you look at these three dots, each one of those dots simply represents a timeline for upgrading a self-contained, self-managed piece of infrastructure. Most likely, this is a big old chassis with all kinds of cards, your IMS infrastructure, your P gateway, your S gateway, all in this tidy, again, self-managed and confined infrastructure that we would invoke different change management windows to upgrade this infrastructure at these points in time. Well, now when you translate to 5G, one of the most interesting dynamics associated with 5G is it is by definition virtualized and contained. Like it's no longer your choice. You don't get to choose, well, I'd like to containerize this piece or I'd like to virtualize that piece. Those decisions are made for you by the sheer nature and makeup of the infrastructure itself. So when you look at 5G and you now understand that, hey, you have this cloud native environment that you have to deal with, right? These Kubernetes environments that are all over the place, right? You're now dealing with a service mesh layer that's necessary in order to orchestrate all the piece parts and components of managing the infrastructure that now plays host to all these different vendors' virtual functions, whether it's, a UPF, an SMF or an AMF function. So we're now thrust immediately into this eclectic hybrid multi-vendor environment that has all these layered components and pieces and parts. And we're now expected to manage, monitor, and troubleshoot this new environment that is always on. It's continuous. And the changes that we see now, it's not odd. I'll put it that way. It's not odd to see a 5G standalone infrastructure upgrade every 48 hours, right? On that type of turntable. So when you translate that to an operations center, to a network operations center, and you think about troubleshooting and you think about segmenting problems down, well, number one, we've just now exponentially increased both the vertical as well as the horizontal segmentation required to find that proverbial interface or node or application or service area that is affected, that is impacting our end users. So even dating back to 3G CDMA and navigating up through 4G, 5G really does, for the first time ever, represent a fundamental shift in the makeup of that infrastructure. And therefore, what we're seeing is a necessity to change the way in which we monitor and we manage both the infrastructure layer as well as the application service layer. And that's what's really meant to be visually depicted here, on this visual, is we believe in a hybrid approach of both passive and active. Passive monitoring is never going to go away. My history and background in the industry is with passive probing and vendors. I spent 15 plus years in that industry across some of the biggest vendors in the industry. And what the dynamic that we see today, though, is really shifting toward this, what we call an always on or a continuous or a heartbeat approach to managing this distributed virtual infrastructure. Because without those 24/7 eyes and ears, regardless of what's actually transpiring on the network, you can't get ahead of these problems in this complex infrastructure. So it really is changing the game in terms of how we have to think about our approach to service assurance as a whole.
Wow, fascinating. That was really a helpful insight into the complexity that we're dealing with here. And Charles, one thing Doug mentioned was cloud native development, which is all the rage these days in the telco world for obvious reasons. And CSPs are adopting cloud and hybrid architectures. What does that mean for active assurance support, given this new world of cloud and multi-cloud?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that you see with the traditional approach of assurance, which was passive, is that it's fairly fixed, right? Passive probing is very good at a lot of things, but one of the things that it's most challenged with, I would argue, is when the workloads become dynamic, and literally the workload, the application, the path may exist 1 minute and be gone the next, may shift from one data center to the next or one host to the next. And so you've got passive architectures that have been designed to know that data will always traverse the same links at the same time, so on and so forth, suddenly becoming highly dynamic. And passive probing has not adapted well to that world. What you really need is something that can respond the way the user responds, right? Leverage the infrastructure the way that a user leverages the infrastructure. And what that brings with it is a couple benefits. The first and foremost is the active approach to assurance reacts to the infrastructure. So if you used to have to go to a certain location to be able to authenticate or be able to do a data transaction, and that path changes, active assurance takes the new path the same way that an end user would take that path. So that's obviously a huge benefit because you're not having to re-architect your assurance visibility strategy every time that the infrastructure changes. Another big benefit of it is that as that path is changing and as it's dynamically updating, active assurance is testing 24/7, 365. So what that effectively means for the consumer is that you don't have to wait until your users are impacted by an issue, whether it's a degradation or an outage, to find out about it. You're finding out about it from the active infrastructure, the active assurance. And so in some instances, you're able to identify, isolate, troubleshoot, and resolve those problems before real users actually experience that degraded performance or that temporary outage and respond accordingly. So active assurance is incredibly well suited, and I would argue it's perhaps the only approach at the moment that can effectively respond to the very hybrid dynamic nature that 5G introduces.
Yeah, that's fascinating. We as enterprises and even individuals are pretty intolerant of degradation of quality of service these days, given the world we're living in. So really good to hear that vision and mission. And Charles, what's the role of AI and machine learning in root cause analysis and problem resolution? It seems to be all the rage. Every vendor and provider is talking about the different uses of AI. What do you think?
Well, just at a very high level, I think, MLAI is a natural extension to the issue identification, resolution capabilities of any assurance platform. But it's critically important in the case of 5G, because as you start to migrate into these new environments, you're dealing with even more transactions, even more data. Think about what IoT does to the number of endpoints that are actively communicating at any given time. An operator simply could never expect to staff their environment effectively enough to be able to identify and resolve degradation as it occurs within the environment. So MLAI is critical because it allows the operator to keep up with the pace of change, identify areas of concern, and respond to those even well before they've actually degraded to the point that anyone would know or care, right? So you don't have to actually set off an alarm bell to be notified that an area is degrading or an area is becoming concerning, and MLAI can be leveraged to help spot those areas of concern well in advance. And so you can really optimize your operations staff and your operations spend into the most critical areas while allowing the assurance platform to do sort of the heavy lifting of issue identification.
Fascinating. Well, that was really a master class in just a few minutes in service assurance. And any final comments or thoughts before we close our little discussion here?
Well, just as an industry or as a whole, Evan, one of the things that I would point out to the audience and the viewers here is that this is a continuum, right? It's an always on, and I do believe as it relates to 5G, better days are ahead. If you think about 5G, a couple of years ago, you couldn't pick up a trade rag or see a headline that wasn't, talking about advanced remote robotic surgery and autonomous drone delivery, and so there were largely dreams of grandeur. But as we as an industry deal with the complexity, the tangible, tactical, daily complexity of what 5G represents from an underlying infrastructure shift as an industry, we've suddenly realized that it's back to the basics, right? Just getting latency in check for high-speed trading applications, right? Getting one-way latency correct for gaming applications, right? A lot of these are, I'll call it the newfound tenets or the old KPIs now becoming new today as an industry. So it's still very, very much early days. But as an industry as a whole, what we have to do is we have to shift our thinking and our thought process as to how we deploy, manage, solve, and then eventually optimize the infrastructure in much the same way the infrastructure itself is evolving. And the way it's evolving is the network, for the very first time, at least in my 25-year history working in this industry, is now acting as an always-on autonomous piece of software. And we've been talking about this for years and years. Yes, we had SD networks, and yes, we have SD-WAN, and we have all these abstractions of software and hardware that have happened over time. But again, 5G represents the first point in time where we're having to fundamentally shift our thinking in terms of these CI/CD models, right? Always on, continuous eyes and ears that are absolutely necessary for us to just be able to keep up with the rate and pace of change, much less to deliver and support a next generation application or service that's going to open up new monetized models for the service provider community as a whole. So again, I would just admonish early days. It's an exciting time in this industry, and more to come from Spirent as well as our customers.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear. I love that 5G is getting practical, it's getting real, and just we're seeing this evolution/revolution in front of our eyes materialize. And it's amazing to see the education and the thought leadership that Spirent is taking with the industry. So thanks for joining and sharing your insights and analysis. And I would encourage everyone to check out Spirent here on Twitter and LinkedIn. there's just a ton of educational content out there to up your game in the telecom network world. So thanks, gentlemen. Great to see and hear
Thank
you.
you guys.
I'm not sure when we'll meet in person next, maybe 5G Barcelona, MWC sometime, but until then, great seeing you.
Great. Thank you guys.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye now.